Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. Conspiracy theories need a scapegoat. Unfortunately, globally and over time, the Jewish people have often been a frequent scapegoat of conspiracists. You could be forgiven then if when I tell you that this week's episode of Horns of a Dilemma deals with the role of the Jews and American support for Israel, you fear that somehow this is going to dabble in conspiracy theories. But if I were to next tell you that the talk is from Walter Russell Mead, author, public intellectual, about his new book, The Ark of a Covenant, you could be forgiven for thinking, well, stop talking then and let me listen to read. In fact, this is exactly what this week's episode of Horns of a Dilemma deals with. Mead talks about how his journey began when, at the behest of the State Department, he was speaking to foreign audiences about American foreign policy and found that otherwise sophisticated audiences would often repeat the trope that America supported Israel only because of the support of the Jews. In fact, Mead realized that the Jewish lobby did not have outsized influence in the United States, but wondered why Israel had assumed such a central place in American foreign policy. His exploration took him from understanding why support for Israel moved from being a cause of the left to being a cause of the right. It also allowed him to see how support for Israel tapped into a deep-rooted idealism and sense of destiny in American foreign policy. This is an interesting and important discussion that was held at the University of Texas, Austin. Let's listen in.
I originally started writing the book, when I first started thinking about it, I wanted to push back on the thesis that somehow the reason that American foreign policy is so pro-Israel is because the Jews are so powerful in the United States. And while there's been, some sort of talk along these lines in the U.S., it's actually much more prevalent overseas. And some of this came out of the experiences I had as a lecturer. The State Department used to ask me to go around and give lectures on the history of American foreign policy to people around the world. So I must have gone to 30 or 40 countries over 25 years. And the number of otherwise really quite intelligent and thoughtful people who, when asked, why does America have the Israel policy or the Middle East policy, their answer was essentially a variant of because the Jews run the United States. And so I want to try to, push back against that, against what you might call the Ye thesis today, the Kanye thesis, which again can exist in both very sophisticated ways and in very crude ways. But what this misses is that, among other things, is that the source for American support for Israel, generally speaking, comes from a variety of places in American culture, in American politics. And the role of American Jews in that mix historically has been less on the whole than many people think, and much more erratic and intermittent. And we'll get to a little bit of that. However, when I started to write this, what I quickly found was that I wasn't going to be able to talk about what was the wrong way to think about the U.S.-Israel relationship until I found a way to talk about, what's the right way? Because ultimately, that's what's convincing, and that's what's real, is you say, no, this is what's going on, and people go, oh. Hopefully they go, oh. And that ended up taking me on kind of a deep dive into the history of American cultural ideas about the Jewish people, Jewish American citizens, foreign Jews, the role of Judaism and Jews in history, the role of the United States in history, American identity, a whole sort of collection of inquiries there. Then it led me, again, because as my core sense is that America's Israel policy has primarily been driven by American global strategy and the place of the Middle East in that strategy, and then the place of Israel in America's Middle East strategy, that you really needed to provide people a kind of a sense of a background of the changing American approach to these questions, particularly over the 20th century. Because very much American policy toward Israel reflects these changing global strategies that we've employed with greater or less success. And then finally, because one of the odd things about support for Israel politically in the U.S. is that it moves from the left in the 1940s and 50s, when really support for Israel was a very left-wing cause in the United States, to the modern times when it's much more of a right-wing cause. Why did that happen? And in some sense, the idea that Israel should lose support on the left is actually not so hard to explain, because Israel has been losing support on the left in Western Europe and in other places too. What's interesting there is that the American left has moved more slowly from very strong pro-Israel sense to very strong anti-Israel, and hasn't moved as far. But then on the other hand, the American left is generally, the Democratic Party anyway, generally is less to the left than most European social democratic parties on a range of issues. So this is what's happened to Israel support on the left is not actually that surprising. What's really rather unique to the United States is the way that support for Israel became a kind of a totemic cause on the American right. So I had to kind of do some digging into thinking about what's been going on in the Republican Party and on the American right, that Israel goes from being kind of a side issue for evangelicals to being a key issue, not only for evangelical Christians, but for all kinds of conservatives. In 1948, the Southern Baptist Convention refused to congratulate Harry Truman for recognizing Israel at its annual conference. This is not an omission, I think, that conference would have made in the 1970s. So, the book took me on a longer and more complicated journey than I ever expected to go, and took a lot longer to write, and is longer to read than I thought it was going to be. For me, it was worth it. And I hope for readers it's also worth it. I've done my best to make it an interesting and even entertaining read, but every author likes to think that that's what they're doing. But it has, I think, sharpened my thinking about American foreign policy and American domestic politics, and I hope that for my readers it had the same effect. So let me today give you kind of 3 ideas, concepts that mattered to me as I was writing the book, that my thinking clarified, and that can give you, I think, a taste of what I'm trying to do here. The first was really the revelation to me of just how long and how widely American opinion, both religious and secular, had seen the return of the Jews to the lands of the Bible as sort of, something that was very desirable and would be a sign that the world was moving in the right direction. And we can find as early as the 17th century in colonial Boston that theologically one of the distinct elements in Puritan thought was exactly this belief that the Bible predicted a return of the Jews to the Holy Land as the world moved toward the final culmination of human affairs. Now, they did not buy into some of the apocalyptic stuff that we are more familiar with today. That's something that dispensationalist theology comes up in the 19th century and becomes popular later. But before dispensationalism was a thing, the New England clergy, including Jonathan Edwards, understood the Bible to read that the Jews would return to the Holy Land. And this was part of a broader kind of theological revaluation of the place of the Jewish people in the minds of sort of predominantly, though not exclusively, Calvinist Protestants in the English-speaking world. And in secular terms, in the 19th century, you begin to get this idea, that we're in an era of progress. Life is really getting better. In the Anglo-American world, this was generally thought of as, okay, in the ancient times, things were glorious and wonderful, but then came in the Middle Ages and barbarism. But beginning with the Renaissance, we recover the learning of the ancient world. With the Reformation, as people would see it in the mostly Protestant U.S. at the time, we recover the true principles of the religion of the ancient world, pure Christianity. And then you get the rise of liberty, the return to the liberty of the ancient world in the Glorious Revolution in England and the American Revolution here. And the principles, then you have science, come flowers out of that. The Enlightenment is flowering out of that. The principles of political economy are flowering out of that. And they see this wave of renewal and redemption spreading across the world. And in particular, they would look at the kind of three great peoples of classical antiquity, the Greeks, the Romans, and the Jews. And if they would look at, they saw them in the 19th century, early 19th century, in much the same way. That is, you read the Bible and, Canaan is a land of milk and honey. It's abundant. And the Hebrews are courageous and brave, right? You read the ancient Greek poets. Greece is a lush land of enormous beauty and agricultural wealth, and the Greeks are brave and virtuous, and they have democracy and these terrific things. And you read Livy and the other Romans, and oh my gosh, Italy was so great. Horace describes the abundance, the beauty. But travelers from America, or people reading about these things in the 19th century, they look at Italy, and you've got Rome as a malarial swampland, people sort of still scrubbing around in the ruins of the past. It's partly run by horrible Habsburgs and other despots, and even worse by the Pope. And even for Catholics, I think, looking back on it, the genius of the Roman Catholic Church is not a genius for civil rule, whatever else we may want to say about the virtues of the Catholic Church. And so, papal misrule, barbarism, misery, oppression, poverty. You look at Greece under the Ottomans, and what do you see? Even worse. The landscape is poor, the people are ignorant, flea-ridden, it's just a horror. How can you even imagine these people are connected with the people that we read about in Homer, or people like Pericles? And then you go to Palestine, and you first look at the condition of the Jews around the world, and they're persecuted everywhere, despised everywhere. And as Mark Twain put it, Palestine is the only thing I've ever seen that comes close to Arizona in terms of being not great. Okay? And so you have this idea that this revival of world culture and civilization and the return of freedom and all of this, when it hits the great classical peoples of antiquity, it'll work for them too. And when people see that, that will make everyone realize that America has it right, that our civilization contains the kind of essence of renewal that is going to change the world. So you have Julia Ward Howe's future husband is a decorated war hero in the Greek Revolution. And there's huge American excitement over the Greek War of Independence against the Ottomans. The wars of Italian liberation and ultimately unification followed with huge attention. The U.S. actually sends the Navy to help evacuate refugees from Rome when the popes Pius IX reimposes papal rule and overthrows the revolutionary Roman Republic. And you actually, in the 19th century, had Americans going to Israel, to Jerusalem, to try to persuade the Jews to start farming and living in a democratic way, because if they did that, if they started to live like Americans, then the land would bloom, the people would bloom, and everybody around the world would understand that America is right. You can actually go to the American Colony Hotel in Jerusalem today. That building has its origins in this movement. The Jews of Jerusalem were not very interested in this, by the way. It's like, no, I'm here to study Torah. I don't want to go out in the hot sun and work on, it's like there was very little interest. But the Italian wars of unification, they wanted Garibaldi to become a general in the American army, tremendous kind of media attention on all of these things. And so obviously in the 20th century, when the kibbutzniks are starting to actually live under democratic institutions and the land is starting to bloom and the Jews, instead of being weak and oppressed and kicked around, are starting to stand up for themselves and look good, you find a lot of people in America going for this. And because in particular, the sort of Jewish element of this narrative of global redemption touches a sweet spot in American culture, because it unites secular liberals who are looking for, in mostly civic terms, for the kind of rise of a civic utopia and a new world order of peace and abundance and all these things, and then Christians who are looking to see vindication of the scriptures. It makes it look as if American civil religion and sort of scriptural religion can come together on this point. In 1891, several years before Herzl writes Der Judenstaat, the founding treatise of the modern Zionist movement in Western Europe, poor President Benjamin Harrison is peacefully sitting at his office when Secretary of State Blaine comes in and hands him a document asking Harrison to try to, through diplomatic methods, to try to get a Jewish state, a Jewish homeland established in Ottoman Palestine. And this document is signed by John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, William McKinley at that time, and a galaxy of newspaper editors and clerical figures from the American establishment, basically in New England and the Midwest. So the American establishment is Zionist before there is a modern organized Zionist movement among the Jews of Europe. And there was a sense in America when Zionism begins to pop up. First, non-Jewish Americans are interested in it a lot more than Jewish Americans are on the whole. Most Jewish Americans were actually quite cold to it in the early years. The New York Times, by the way, was a Zionist newspaper under Christian ownership. When it was bought by a Jewish publisher, it became an anti-Zionist newspaper. Then the Sulzbergers, I think, converted to Christianity, and the Times became, for at least a while, a more Zionist newspaper. So interesting, the relationship is not what people would casually think. Anyway, I think in some ways, this idea of the existence of Israel, meaning that America is on the right track and that the world will see that, gets a big boost in the 1940s. Let's just think about life in 1944. You first start getting the Soviet troops break into Poland and start liberating the extermination camps. There had been news stories about the Holocaust before then, and people who followed things closely were aware of some pretty horrible things going on in Europe. But it's one thing to read newspaper accounts or see letters, but it's another thing when the newsreel is showing pictures of emaciated survivors and piles of hair and all the horrible pictures that we have become so painfully familiar with ever since. And the reality of this thing begins to sink in. Now, people often talk about this as creating sympathy for the Jews, and it did create sympathy for the Jews, but I think it had another more profound cultural resonance for people, which is, what does this say about the Enlightenment? There was this belief that very widespread in American society, and not just in American society, that the progress of science, philosophy, reason, knowledge, technology was going to rid humanity of these ancient evils of war, of hatred, of all the sort of irrational demons that in the past have wreaked such terrible havoc on human society and the human race. And so we were going to get better and better in every way, and we could look forward to a peaceful future based on the simple progress of science and technology in an enlightened setting. But, Germany, where philosophy had flourished, Germany, the great jewel in the crown of 19th century European civilization in so many extraordinary ways, right, turns out to have harbored, an evil so astonishing that it would shock the most depraved cave person. That there's no moral progress, no such thing as moral progress. The human heart is as dark and as bitter and as easily led to hate as it's ever been. And that's a shock, I think, that is still very much with us today in many ways. People try to fight it, people try to get away from it, but it kind of keeps coming back. Then 1945, what do you have? Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so this species that has no power of self-control, that is entirely as irrational, blood-loving, cruel, susceptible to superstitious hatred and everything as it's ever been, now has the power to destroy itself and perhaps someday all life on earth. Right? So those two things come together, and it's pretty terrifying. And then in 1948, Israel, against the against what all the military leaders of the day, people like General Marshall and Field Marshal Montgomery predicted, Israel wins its war of independence against the Arabs backed by Great Britain and emerges, and it's like, wait a minute, for Americans with hundreds of years of this kind of cultural seepage of the idea of, the Bible predicts the Jews will return, you get this sense of God is still at work in history. And we should not think this is just something that the fundamentalists pick up or the biblical literalists, but you can have a very sophisticated view of the creation of the books of the Bible and say, well, sure, there wasn't just one prophet Isaiah. There's like 6 different Isaiahs, and they write at different times, and so we shouldn't take all of these prophecies. Blah. You can do all of that, but still, none of the Bible was written before 1948. It's all a lot older than that. And so for all kinds of people in the world of American religion, this becomes a kind of a touchstone that in our terrifying times, when it looks as if the humanity is approaching an apocalypse, God is still at work in the world. The big guy upstairs is still here, and he's looking out for us. And in the same way, for less religious, liberal Americans, people like Eleanor Roosevelt, the idea that the United Nations in its first great act was to restore the people of the Jewish people to a state after the horrors of the Holocaust. And that this was the sign, even though the Arabs rejected and fought against it, the Israelis had prevailed, and it was seen as the dawn of a new era of international law, as the vindication of American principles by liberals as well as by religious people, both liberal and conservative. And while over time, our reactions to the reality and the reality itself have grown much more complex, that kind of imprint of the 1940s on the public mind is very much with us. Certainly, I think the shocks of the Holocaust and Hiroshima continue to form a kind of a foundation of modern consciousness. And we've been reminded by President Putin recently, as he idly fingers the nuclear card in his hand, that we're still facing some of the same kinds of evil, and we're still facing the same kinds of ultimate weapons that we faced in the past. So there's a place that Israel occupies in the American mind. I say in the book, it occupies a speck on the map of the world, but it occupies a continent in the American mind. And if we want to understand how the subject of Israel is raised in American politics and how the debates go, we can't lose this. We can't lose sight of this. So the second thing I guess I learned that really hit me in the book is that, and part of this is a reflection of the first, that in reality, American strategy toward Israel, wise or foolish, pro or con, has generally been guided by the prevailing strategic consensus in the U.S. over our global policy. However, at the same time, both pro and anti-Israel writers and the public in America want to mythologize and exaggerate the nature of the American relationship. So if you look at the way both pro and anti-Israel writers write about the period of 1945 to 1948, when the state is trying to emerge and the U.S. and Britain are arguing about what to do and so on, there's both pro and anti-Israel, and in fact pro and anti-Jewish writers will say, America was central to the emergence of Israel. Harry Truman was central to American policy at that time, and the American Jews were central to Harry Truman's decision-making. Now, in fact, Joseph Stalin actually played a larger historical role in the emergence of Israel than Harry Truman did. And the Truman administration was actually still, on the day the Israelis declared independence, the Truman administration was still trying to persuade them not to delay, because under George Marshall's advice, the Truman administration believed that the Jews would lose the war, ultimately. They were wrong. The reason they were wrong was that Stalin had begun to supply the Jews in Palestine with weapons beginning in March of 1948, and would continue that supply of arms, ultimately in defiance of a Middle East of an embargo imposed by the UN. The U.S. had put up an arms embargo on both sides. One which had the practical impact of helping the Arabs who were getting arms from the British and cutting the Jews off from any real supply of arms, an argument that was quite widely made by Zionist lobbyists at the time. Truman never moved a finger to lift that embargo, but Stalin did. And those arms actually, they were actually Czech arms. The Skoda manufacturing arms place had made a lot of weapons for the German Wehrmacht, which oddly stopped taking delivery in May of 1945. And so they had all these surplus weapons lying around. And what they asked Stalin if it was okay if they could sell them to the Jews. They were desperate for hard currency. In the winter of 48, the communists do a coup in Czechoslovakia, and an already dire economic situation becomes even worse. And the reply from Moscow, and they ask actually to join the Marshall Plan because that's a source of money. The reply from Moscow is, those arms sales, that's your Marshall Plan. And they sell these weapons for hard currency to the Israelis, and many of them still have the swastikas and other Wehrmacht markings on them, the weapons with which the Israelis win their war of independence. But in the American historical mind, both among and by the way, none of this is a result of secret archival research that I've done. This is all, if you just look around and pay attention, this record is there. It's better known in Israel than in the U.S. But right from then to now, there's been a kind of consistent desire in the United States to turn this story into something different. Just as there is a desire to say the U.S. and Israel have always been allies, and that Israel would not survive without American help. That, again, is something that you'll hear from both pro and anti-Israel people. None of this is true. When Israel was poor and weak and really needed an ally, the United States actually was much more interested in making Nasser the key in Egypt, the key of its Middle East policy. This is under the Eisenhower administration, and consistently prefers the Egyptians over the Israelis. I say in the book that Israel did not become strong because it had an American alliance. It gained an American alliance because it had grown strong. But the desire both on the right and the left to mythologize this and to say that what is now the case, the U.S. and Israel being allies, has always been the case, and that American support has always been critical to Israel, is something you will hear from AIPAC, and it will be something that you will hear from CARE or other anti-groups. So, interesting. What else, but what did then shape it? It seems to me that what has shaped it is the evolution of American strategic thought. You have to look at in different eras to see what American presidents thought they were doing. What was the world situation like? So for Eisenhower, all right, his goal is to create, not just in the Middle East, but globally, an alliance between Americans and modernizing forces in developing countries. In the 40s and 50s, with many states just recently coming out of colonialism, these are almost always military governments. And the military was seen as a professional modernizing elite. And so the U.S. working with these groups, which means distinguishing yourselves from the British and the French and those other evil colonizers, but you have more to offer these groups in their modernization than the Soviets do. So they would be smarter to align with you. And Egypt was seen as the great prize of this strategy in the Middle East. It didn't work out for reasons we can discuss if you would like. The next era, the change, it's really Richard Nixon, who was one of the American presidents most hated by the American Jewish community. And if we listen to some of the tapes of his private taping, one of the more anti-Semitic presidents in recent memory. It was Richard Nixon who first forges the basis of what we would now call an alignment rather than alliance at that time between the U.S. and Israel at the time of the 73 Yom Kippur War. Again, very complex things are going on here, but primarily it's seen as, first of all, the Soviet Union is trying to use Syria as a way, and the war as a way to wedge itself more deeply into the Middle East. And so and Egypt at that time still had its Soviet connection. So resisting the Soviet clients was clearly a part of Cold War stuff. But also Nixon was worried. At this time, the Israelis had nuclear weapons, and the Americans knew this. And it was clear that if the Israelis started to lose the Yom Kippur War, they wouldn't fold their hands and sort of die in peace and resignation. They would use those nuclear weapons. If you worry about disruption to American oil supplies and to the Middle East at a time of great shortages in the oil market and price hikes and stuff like this, you don't want Israel to feel that it has no option but nuclear weapons. Supplying Israel with the weapons that it needed to defeat the Syrians and the Egyptians is part of the next stage in the unfolding of American Middle East policy in the Cold War. After the fall of the Shah, up until 1979, Iran was the big recipient of U.S. aid in the Middle East. When Iran falls, Israel and Egypt kind of jointly become the heirs to that place in American strategy. We could go on, but today, and in more recent years, as America started to think about moving away from the Middle East, you see, particularly in the Obama administration and now in the Biden administration, distances opening up between the United States and Israel. So I don't want to get into this in too much detail because I think I'm already verging on exhausting your patience. But it remains the case to this day that the best guide to American policy in Israel is not, vis-a-vis Israel, is not, sort of what is the Israel lobby telling the American president to do. It's how does the American president see the national interest and what is the place that Israel occupies in that vision. Doesn't mean that the not saying that the Israel lobby has no influence. I compare it in the book in its way to the NRA and the AARP as a lobby that really does have some weight, but it is in a much more restricted kind of field than people see. You can't push a president pretty far from his vision of what the national interest will be. And the final point that I found in the book that might be useful for your thinking is that since 1990, our strategies toward Israel, as in the past, have reflected our views of the international situation, so that, for example, after 9/11, when America sort of, focused on terror, Israel becomes a key ally. As we move away from that, Israel's place in the hierarchy of American foreign policy diminishes. But fundamentally, since 1990, I found that what we've had is a national strategy that doesn't work particularly well, that is not based on reality very effectively. In this way, it's a bit like the 1920s and 30s, when the American strategic consensus was not well matched to the actual international situation. And while we didn't fail at everything in the 1920s and 30s, we soon found that we were going to have to change the way we dealt with a lot of questions if we were going to be able to go on living the way we wanted. If you think about it, in 1989, 1990, with the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States actually adopted the most revolutionary and far-reaching policy that any state has ever adopted in the history of the human race, which was basically we were going to do in globally what West Germany was trying to do in East Germany after the Cold War. That is, we were going to introduce the economics, the politics, the culture, the international role, vision of international society of the West into the rest of the world. And we were doing this because we believed that history was over, that the arc of history was bending in this way. Again, this touches on a lot of long-standing American optimism, some of it linked, actually, historically, to our views of Israel and its role in the world. But this sense of America as a nation with a mission, a nation that's here to change the way the world works, kind of both neoconservatives and liberal internationalists after the end of the Cold War are seized by this idea. And okay, well, we can turn China into a democracy by letting it into the WTO. We can make Mexico a stable democracy with NAFTA. We can cut our military budget, cut our foreign aid budget, even cut our propaganda budget while we make the world change more than anybody's ever gotten it to change before. And the reason that we can do this is not because we're going to go around fighting people to do it, because we actually don't want to do that. We're not Sisyphus pushing a stone uphill. We're more like people standing at the top of a mountain rolling a snowball downhill. The world wants to change the way we want to change it, and we're just sort of providing a little nudge so that humanity can go on its appointed way. The Middle East peace process, our idea that we would be able to get the Israelis and the Palestinians to accept not just a truce, an armed truce, but a real peace where there's trade and, sort of normal relationships. That was a part of this worldwide idea of making the whole world look more like Western Europe and North America. And the sort of hubristic ideas behind it, the unwillingness to pay close attention to some of the deep historical obstacles, both on the Israeli side and on the Palestinian side, that make that difficult, very much went into it. And again, in the book, I look at the rise and fall of the peace process. Maybe for our purposes here, it's just enough to say that not in the whole history of the United States, there has been no diplomatic effort that has had as much attention from presidents and secretaries of state, that has engaged the attention of the American public and the American media, and that has had so much international attention as this Arab-Israeli peace process under American sponsorship, which testifies, it seems to me, both to the extraordinarily powerful hold that the idea of Israel has on the American mind, and to the lack of wisdom and self-knowledge in the way America has been engaging with the world over the last 30 years.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.